The sudden Maryland invasion by General Lee and his rebel army shocked and frightened many people throughout the Union for what it represented. This Civil War was no longer confined to Virginia, and any state on the Atlantic coast was now at the threat from a ravenous Confederate army marching north. Compounded with this was incursions coordinated with other invasions of Kentucky by Braxton Bragg's Army of Mississippi and Edmund Kirby Smith's Army of Kentucky to wreak as much havoc as possible with their smaller yet more agile armies. When Lee proposed and enacted his campaign to invade Maryland, many in the Confederate government were left to wonder about the righteousness of such a plan. This action was in direct conflict with their strategy of fighting a defensive war against the tyranny of the Lincoln administration. To combat this, Confederate President Jefferson Davis instructed his invading generals to draft a public proclamation of the states they invaded to announce their army's intentions. Davis hoped to clarify that the Confederacy's intention was to fight a war of self-defense and that his government had no desire to conquer. These military actions, while appearing drastic or belligerent, were only being undertaken to ensure by what right they aimed to do, a peaceful secession from the United States. Davis's intention with his general proclamation were good, but this decree failed to get to the commanding generals until they released their own proclamations. Unlike Davis's proclamation, Lee and the other generals failed to address why the South shifted its strategy from defense to offense like Davis had desired. Lee's personal decree declared that his army has come to Maryland's aid with the deepest sympathy for the wrongs that have been inflicted upon the citizens of the Commonwealth allied to the states of the South by the strongest social, political, and commercial ties, and to aid you in throwing off this foreign yoke, to enable you again to enjoy the inalienable rights of free men. Such proclamations were only sensible and true to the ears of Southern citizens and patriots, but to many people in New England and even in Maryland, it was an insult upon the Union that they loved. Upon hearing Confederate armies moving about in Maryland, hysteria ran rampant. Philadelphia, despite being over 150 miles away from the Confederates and being in no real immediate danger, went into a frenzied phase of preparations to defend the city with earthworks. Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania called out for 50,000 militia to turn out and nominated Major General John F. Reynolds to lead them. Church bells throughout the Keystone State called men to drill. While the states around Lee's invasion was sent into a state of fear, General McClellan was organizing and getting his army ready to march out against his nemesis from the 7 days battle. Lee's Maryland campaign had many goals and was incited for various reasons. By defeating Pope at Second Manassas, while McClellan's army was still being unloaded at Washington, Lee was allowed to gain the military initiative in order to bring the war to a close end in the quickest manner he believed he was able to. However, this invasion was more about the strategic and perhaps personal to Lee. Since the start of the war, from the firing on Fort Sumter to the first land battles of Philippi and Big Bethel, all the way up to Chantilly on the first day of September, all of it has been fought on Virginia soil, or in the South. Lee wanted to bring this devastating war away from his beloved state of Virginia by any means, and that meant that he would have to take his army north and allow their destructive conflict to be fought on the doorsteps of the Union States. One of Lee's major campaign goals was to destroy the major rail lines throughout the North to hurt their war effort. Therefore, he had his sights in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a major railroad, manufacturing, and communication hub that had supported the early Union overland campaigns. There was also political ramifications in this gamble of an invasion. The Confederacy was at a disadvantage from the start of the war, but if they could manage to pull the European powers like France and the United Kingdom into the conflict, their chances of success would skyrocket. Lee was well aware of this, and he realized a major victory on Union soil would legitimize the Confederacy as a true nation-state for the many military observers and diplomats from Europe. If Lee could get his hands on Harrisburg, he could turn the war in the favor of the Confederacy. At Lee's new headquarters in Leesburg, the aged general moved all of his pieces into place in order to cover much ground as possible while dealing the most damage to the federal war effort. Lee decided to split his army into 4 different parts. Lee sent Major General James Longstreet to Boonesboro, then on to Hagerstown to deal with the federal militiamen that had been sighted. General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was sent to deal with the 13,000-strong garrison that was trapped in the arsenal town of Harpers Ferry. This riverside town, made famous by the raid led by the famous abolitionist John Brown, would become the cornerstone of Lee's effort in his early campaign. Jackson was to neutralize the garrison, secure the Shenandoah Valley, capture its supplies, and keep Lee's supply lines safe from federal hands. Lee believed this operation would be finished by September 12th. The third force was Stuart's cavalry arm, which was to screen and scout for Lee's separated columns, while the fourth and final force under D.H. Hill was to guard the Army's rear at South Mountain, blocking any advance of federal forces from Washington that wanted to engage the separated Confederate Army. Even though Lee had the initiative in Maryland, his army was plagued with difficulties from the start. Lee had 55,000 men to invade Maryland by September 11th, 10 days after the final defeat of Pope at Chantilly. However, Lee would lose over 10,000 soldiers from problems that plagued such armies of the day. Disease ran rampant through his camps, and the hard-paved roads of Maryland caused many men to fall out of line due to exhaustion and injuries. However, curiously among these large losses were those Confederate soldiers that refused to cross into Maryland. These men had volunteered to defend their homes from Union invasion, not to bring the war into the Union itself, and did not march with the rest of the army. Lee's army at the start of the invasion would be in its worst condition for the remainder of the war until its surrender. While many fall behind, Lee commanded his generals to deal with the stragglers harshly since he considered them cowards. While his generals moved in all directions, Lee converged on Frederick to mingle with the locals. Lee believed that Maryland was a Confederate secessionist keg waiting to explode, but he was sorely disappointed. When Marylanders heard of his invasion, they signed up in droves to Union regiments to oust Lee from their home state. On September 7th, McClellan's 80,000-man army, now rested and resupplied, cautiously made their way west in pursuit of Lee in 3 different columns. McClellan, in a manner reminiscent of his Peninsula campaign, believed Lee outnumbered his own army despite the truth of Lee's own depleted army. Of his army, a fourth of that would be made up of raw recruits, many who have seen no combat at all. These troops under McClellan were not in the best state of mind either. After the major defeats at the 7 Days Battle and the Battle of Second Manassas, many believed they were losing, with a sequential invasion by Lee not helping to raise their morale. On September 12th, the advanced elements of the Army of the Potomac entered Frederick to find it empty of Confederate forces, with no idea of Confederate movements or intent. McClellan was ideally chasing a headless chicken. It was here, however, where the tides of fate and warfare intervened, or perhaps it was simple but extreme luck, and spared Little Mac from his fears. Corporal Barton W. Mitchell of the 27th Indiana came across 3 cigars wrapped in an old piece of paper, upon which was written something called Special Order 191 in its entirety. The order was written by Lee to D.H. Hill, detailing the strength and movements of all of Lee's forces in Maryland. Seeing the significance of the document, Mitchell sent the copy up his chain of command, which finally made it in the hands of McClellan. Upon learning of it, McClellan was said to cheer out loud. He had all the information he needed to defeat Lee. Upon realizing the garrison of Harpers Ferry was in grave danger, McClellan drew up a 2-pronged offensive on September 14th. The offensive called for Major General William B. Franklin in command of 19,000 men from the 6th and 4th Corps to be sent to the aid of Harpers Ferry, while the rest of the army, which consisted of the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 9th, and 12th Corps, to cross over South Mountain and descend on Boonesboro to split Lee and his forces at Boonesboro from the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia. But unbeknownst to McClellan, the Confederates were in an even more dire situation than what was on Special Order 191. The Confederates divided their forces even more after leaving Frederick, with Longstreet in command of 2 divisions, while D.H. Hill was alone at Boonesboro with 1 division. On the 13th, while Jackson balled up the Federals at Harpers Ferry, Lee learned of the Federal advance toward South Mountain and dispatched a warning to Jackson to hurry up with neutralizing the Federal garrison, and to Longstreet to come back to Boonesboro the next morning. Lee then commanded D.H. Hill to defend the gaps at South Mountain. McClellan decided to attack the Confederates on the 14th and formed his forces to attack at Turner's Fox's and Crampton's Gap at South Mountain. Confederate Colonel Alfred H. Colquitt and his brigade of Georgians held Turner's Gap. He was pushed up the ridge but refused to yield the gap to a ferocious attack of a brigade of Western Union men led by General John Gibbon. It was these troops that Hooker saw and said that they must be made of iron. With that simple statement, the heraldry of the Union Iron Brigade, considered to be one of the best federal fighting forces in the Civil War, got its moniker. The Confederates in Turner's Gap would be flanked and forced to fall back, but they would hold strong onto the gap itself until nightfall. In Fox's Gap, south of Turner's, the Federals of Jesse Reno's 9th Corps pushed hard against Thomas Drayton's South Carolinians and Georgians defending the gap, yet failed to capitalize on their advance due to their exhaustion in their initial push and the timely arrival of John Bell Hood and his Texans. Finally, in Crampton's Gap, the southernmost point of the battle, Lafayette McLaws was tasked in defending the gap. However, he had only 500 to defend the gap, and he had no clue about the 12,000 men of the Union 4th and 6th Corps that advanced on him. The Federals took 3 hours to assault the gap, but eventually seized it and captured 400 Confederates who arrived late as reinforcements. The arrival of night saved most of the Confederate positions, but Lee realized he had no chance of holding his position against a dedicated Federal assault after the fall of Crampton's Gap. Lee ordered his army to withdraw. His campaign had failed, and he had to save his army. During these movements of McClellan to attack at South Mountain, General Jackson was still surrounding Harper's Ferry from 3 sides. Thomas Jackson was an expert artilleryman and was able to act independently while on campaign or in battle. Therefore, he was highly trusted by Lee to do whatever he commanded. Facing Jackson was Colonel Dixon S. Miles, who was the senior commander over the 13,000-strong garrison. Miles, who had very little experience of leading men, took his orders to the word, which were to hold the town. Harper's Ferry was an interesting place to hold a garrison since it was a small, low-lying river town that was at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, with the heights around it commanding the town. By this, he only lightly defended the strategic land around Harper's Ferry, which included the heights of Loudon and Maryland Heights. Upon hearing about the Confederates were headed their way, the men of the garrison, mostly made up of inexperienced militia and volunteers, dug primitive fortifications on top the heights surrounding the town and sent skirmishers against the oncoming Confederate columns, who stopped in their tracks on September 12th. On the 13th, the Confederates began their attacks early in the morning and attacked both the left and right flanks of the Federal defenses on Maryland Heights that guarded the river entrance to the town. The inexperienced Federals held their positions at first, but the trials of combat soon proved too great a task to overcome, and the entire garrison fled back to the town. Upon realizing that they were surrounded, Miles sent a plea for help to McClellan on the night of the 13th, although by then it was too late for the entrapped garrison. The morning of September 14th revealed that Jackson had done what was unthinkable. He had hauled all of his artillery to the heights surrounding the town to allow for perfect sights for the Confederate artillerymen. Each gun took 200 men each with ropes to drag the cannons up the steep embankments into their positions. When the bombardment commenced that day, the Confederate soldiers saw their labors were wholly worth it, and the Federals realized that their situation was hopeless. On the 15th, following another massive artillery bombardment, Miles raised a white flag and surrendered the Arsenal town, but was mostly wounded by a shell and died the next day. The surrender of Harper's Ferry was the largest capture of Federal soldiers during the entire war. With news of the surrender, Jackson sent Lee the good news. It was a welcome comfort for the near defeat that had occurred at South Mountain the day before. Upon receiving the news of the imminent surrender of the Harper's Ferry garrison, Lee changed his plans and halted his forces behind Antietam Creek and sent an urgent message to all of his commanders to converge on Sharpsburg. Lee waited on McClellan to react to his success at South Mountain. If McClellan would press hard and fast, Lee would retreat towards Virginia. If he was cautious, Lee might be able to concentrate his forces and offer battle in Maryland, a prospect to achieve a victory on what was still technically northern soil. If Lee remained in Sharpsburg, he could possibly check or rout the Federals, then move north toward Harrisburg. Lee looked at the ground around Sharpsburg and declared, "We will make our stands on these hills." Hours after arranging the terms of the surrender, Jackson left Harper's Ferry for Sharpsburg with 2 of his divisions and left A.P. Hill in 1 division to carry out the details of the surrender. Lee, currently with 20,000 men stationed in and around Sharpsburg, formed his lines to appear as if he possessed more soldiers than he actually had. a bluff that had worked time and time again against McClellan. Lee gambled that McClellan would not be ready to attack either on the 15th or 16th, but would be ready at least by the 17th. Even though there were 60,000 Federals stationed east of the Antietam Creek, with reports coming in from both the positions of Lee and the Confederates around Harpers Ferry, McClellan believed Lee was on the retreat south into Virginia, but further reconnaissance confirmed that Lee had not left yet. Throughout the day of the 15th, thousands of Confederates marched into Sharpsburg. By the 16th, Lee had 35,000 men and 200 guns on hand, while the Federals on the opposite side of the Antietam had 87,000 men and 300 guns. The Federal army began to arrive en masse on the eastern side of the Antietam Creek. Lee put Jackson in command of his left flank around the West Woods, East Woods, and Dunker Church, which was anchored by the Potomac. Longstreet was given the command of the right flank, which was anchored by the Antietam. With his pieces in place, McClellan ordered Hooker to cross the Antietam with his First Corps to get at Lee's left flank. At dusk, Hooker bumped into Hood's division in the East Woods and engaged in a protracted skirmish until dark. It was this action that many soldiers described in the late night hours of the 16th as some of the most terrifying of the war. Imagine being ordered to advance and fight in pitch-black darkness where the only light provided is that fire from enemy muskets that hid in a thick wood line. The inclusion of further regiments from both sides and later cannon blasts only further added to the confusion and terror of the night's fighting. Eventually, the two armies withdrew from the fight due to a light rainfall that started. While the total casualties numbered only around 200 men, the skirmish revealed to Lee a vital piece of information in that it would seem that McClellan intended to attack his left flank. The area around Dunker Church and the three wooded areas was reinforced. Opposite the Confederates, shortly after midnight, Joseph K. Mansfield's 12th Corps crossed the Antietam and camped near George Lyon's farm, preparing themselves for the inevitable action the next day. Hood managed to convince Jackson his two brigades that skirmished in the East Woods to be moved behind Dunker Church to allow them to cook a hot meal, which they had not had in days. Jackson was allowed on the condition that Hood and his troops come immediately when called. So Hood's division and other Confederates fell into their camps to make their own preparations for the fighting in the morrow. Union General Alpheus Williams wrote to his family that it was a night he would never forget, so dark, so obscure, so mysterious, so uncertain, with the occasional rapid volley of pickets and outposts, the low, solemn sound of the command as troops came into position, and withal a certain impression that the morrow was to be great with the future fate of our country. So much responsibility, so much intense, future anxiety. Such feelings of anxiety were not confined to General Williams. Many men of both armies knew that their opponents were mere miles away, and the feeling of a large climactic clash was looming in the camps. For every man there, whether they be Federal or Confederate, volunteer or conscript, if they fought for their country, for their home, or because they're forced, all these men were much alike and ready to do or die in order to win. One thing that was certain, these regiments of men from Texas and Wisconsin, Alabama and Pennsylvania, Georgia and New York, the Carolinas and Massachusetts, all of them would soon meet not as brothers or neighbors or patriots of their nation, but as vicious and hateful enemies. Near the sleepy town of Sharpsburg, on the banks of the Antietam Creek, Lee and McClellan would finally clash again and bring about a day of ruin that had not been seen before in the annals of their shared history.